Today we're talking about difficult conversations, and the kind of conversations that I can consider to be difficult include disciplining or terminating people, talking to employees about personal issues such as body odor, improper attire, and having to deal with angry or potentially violent employees. Now, these are difficult conversations, I think, because it's not fun to have them, for one thing. When you are someone, especially who is concerned about people's feelings, then it's not fun to have these conversations because you might hurt their feelings. Another reason that I consider them to be difficult is because you don't know how people are going to respond. People usually respond badly when you tell them things that they don't want to hear. And all of these difficult conversations are things that people don't want to hear. People don't want to be told that they have body odor. They don't want to be disciplined. They don't want to be terminated for the most part. And so they tend to respond badly, which only makes the situation scarier when you have to initiate the difficult conversation. So today, the objective is to help prepare you for difficult conversations. And there is a method of preparation. There's a format that you can use when delivering the conversation that will make it less difficult for you. Also, there are things that you can do to help it make it less difficult for the person on the receiving end as well. And so going into these conversations usually is not pleasant, but if you handle it well, then sometimes the difficult conversation is the best thing that you can ever do for that employee. So let's get started. Before you have a difficult conversation, the thing to remember is why we communicate in the first place. If you weren't here for last week's webinar, we talked about communication and the fact that we communicate to get a desired response from our audience. Every time we send a message, it's to get a specific response back, not just any old response, but a response that we want. So if you say hello to somebody, you want them to say hello back. If you ask a question, you want an answer. If you tell a joke, you want to laugh. Every time you send a message, it's to get a specific response back. When you have to initiate a difficult conversation, focus on the response that you want from the other person. So if you are telling them that they violated policy, the response that you want is that they won't violate policy. If you tell them that they have body odor, the response that you want is that they won't have body odor. If you terminate them, the response that you want is for them to go away quietly and never come back. So focus on creating the message to get that response. And when you do that, you're halfway there. Before we talk about how to format your response, think about how you tend to communicate. Again, those of you who did not listen in on last week's webinar don't have this information. And I know that there are some of you who were in last week's webinar, so hopefully this repetition won't be too boring for you. But it's really important that we determine how we tend to send our messages, because what we do sometimes is that we prevent ourselves from getting the response that we want by how we send the message. Now, a lot of people are oblivious to how they communicate. And so it's important for us to be able to recognize how we communicate, recognize the things that we might do that prevents us from getting the response that we want, and fix it. And so here's that information. First bullet point, are you direct and sometimes brutally honest? Well, this personality style and communication style is the dominant doer. And the dominant doer is someone who is very direct. They like to say things as quickly as possible and move on to the next task. And that's what this personality style is like. They're very task-oriented. They try to say things in a way that is very clear so that there is no misunderstanding, so that people can quickly get the task accomplished. So you know exactly how they feel about things because they say it. There's no misunderstanding them for the most part. But that dominant personality style and their directness sometimes is brutally honest with people. They don't mince words. They don't spend time trying to figure out how they might say things in a way that is not direct. And so that brutal honesty sometimes can be very hurtful for other people. With the dominant, they just tell it like it is. But that telling it like it is sometimes inspires people to respond poorly to their communication. And so that dominant personality style can be honest, but they just need to choose words carefully so that they don't destroy people in the process. Next bullet point, are you personable and like to keep it light? Well, that personality style is what I call the initiator influencer. And the initiator influencer is chatty and friendly, and they like people. And sometimes they hate having these conversations because they don't want people to think badly about them. That's one of the reasons they communicate the way that they do. They say a lot about themselves, are very interested in other people, and they joke around a lot. They're storytellers. And so things that the initiator influencer needs to be careful about is that they don't joke around when they're having a difficult conversation. Because when they do, sometimes people don't take them seriously. When facilitating this workshop, I have participants practice difficult conversations. And I was observing a pair going through this conversation, and the person sending the message was talking to the receiver about being late to work. So she was saying, you have been late to work at least 15 minutes, 3 times this week alone. You need to get to work on time, but no big deal. That's the keeping it light part. And I said to her, no, because that's all they're going to remember is that it's really no big deal if you come to work on time. It is a big deal if you come to work on time. And so that initiator influencer needs to make sure that they don't joke around at all during this conversation to ensure that people take them seriously. Next bullet point, are you tactful and sometimes indirect? Well, that's what I call the steady satisfier. And the steady satisfier is very people-oriented also. They like people a lot, and they hate to hurt people's feelings. They are the ones out of all of our styles that are going to be most reluctant to have this difficult conversation. They don't like people to be unhappy. They don't like to tell people things that are hurtful or could sound hurtful in any way. And so they're very tactful. They use or choose their words very carefully, but sometimes they're so indirect that people don't know what they're talking about. I witnessed a steady satisfier firing somebody one time, and the person who was fired didn't know he was fired. Now, that sounds unbelievable, but it's true. I saw it. And so the steady satisfier is telling this person, perhaps you might be happier elsewhere. Perhaps there are other opportunities for you, that type of thing. And the person on the receiving end had no idea that he was being terminated. So that steady satisfier can be so indirect sometimes, people don't know what they're talking about. And then finally, are you no nonsense and just stick to the facts? This is what's called the conscientious critic. And this person is very task-oriented also and not worried so much about people's feelings, sometimes oblivious to people's feelings. And so in having these conversations, sometimes they come off across as cold and uncaring. And the fact that they just stick to the facts and don't really have anything personable in the conversation is what makes them appear cold and uncaring. Once upon a time, I had a supervisor many, many years ago who, after I returned from surgery, the first words out of her mouth were, "Do you have your return to work release?" And so this communication style, this personality style, is usually a rule follower and wants to make sure that everyone else is following the rules. And so, no, I didn't have my return to work release, but instead of those being the first words out of her mouth, it would have had a better impact on me if she would have said, "Hey, you just had major surgery and you're already back at work. Are you okay?" But the first words out of her mouth were, "Do you have your return to work release?" Which made me think that she cares only about following the rules and not about me as a person. And that's how that style comes across sometimes. So All of us have a predominant style that comes out when we communicate. We don't fit nicely into a category, but we have a style that comes out, and that style helps us get the responses that we want, but it also prevents us from getting the responses that we want. And so look at how you tend to communicate with people. And when you're sending this message that is difficult, you need to incorporate all three of the styles, or the four of the styles, the best of the four styles. You need to be direct, like the dominant personality style, but personable, like the initiator influencers, so that people feel that you care about them, tactful, so that you're choosing your words carefully, you're being honest but not destroying people in the process, and factual, so that you have your facts straight, because that's one of the things when you go into these conversations, you need to make sure you have your facts straight. Now, what happens to people sometimes when they're initiating a difficult conversation is that they experience the fight or flight syndrome. And the fight or flight syndrome is something that's very instinctive in us when we feel that we're in a threatening situation. It's one of our most basic instincts that we have. And what happens to the body in response to the fight or flight syndrome doesn't feel good. Our heart begins to race so that it can pump blood to our arms and legs so we can fight or flee. Our adrenal gland kicks into high gear, and that usually manifests itself in shaking. Our stomach doesn't feel good because all of the blood is going to the arms and the legs, and so anything that's in there is encouraged to get out. And it's hard for us to think when we have all this oxygen going to our arms and legs and not going into our brain. So that's what happens to us, and it's great when we have to fight something or run away. But when you're in a difficult conversation, you can't do either one. And so you need to be able to control the fight or flight syndrome. How do you do it? One of the things you do is prepare. And by preparation, it means that before you go into the conversation, you have thought about what you're going to say. Maybe you've even written notes for yourself. Maybe you've even practiced what you're going to say to somebody, which I think is a great thing to do, because that way you can see how it will be received before you actually deliver the message. So you prepare, you get yourself all ready to go. You've gathered all of the facts that you need to gather. When you get into the conversation, and even beforehand, breathe deeply so that it slows the heart rate down, it gets oxygen to the brain so that you can think again. And so deep breathing before you go into the conversation and during the conversation is important in order to remain calm. And chances are, when you deliver this message, the listener is going to experience the fight or flight syndrome too. And what happens with that is that sometimes they get very defensive when they're on the receiving end. So that means you don't get to attack or defend yourself. And that's very difficult not to do. When you deliver the message, somebody goes into self-defense mode, and then you go into self-defense mode. But when you're in a supervisory position or an HR professional, you can't attack or defend yourself. And so what do? Well, the thing that I encourage people to do is when that happens, stick to the script. So what does stick to the script mean? Well, in your preparation, perhaps you've written a couple of notes down or you've rehearsed what you're going to say in your brain. When you get counterattacked, stick to the script. Just go back to what your notes say or that little rehearsal that you've already had. Say basically the same stuff that you've already said. And that way, that will help you maintain your calm. If you have ever taken a psych class, you're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you don't know what this pyramid is about, I'll tell you. Maslow was a psychologist, and he said that we are all needy people walking around trying to have our needs met. And that's why we communicate in the first place, is to have our needs met. But we also feel that when people are not communicating the way that we want them to, or behaving the way that we want them to, they could be threatening our needs. So I'm going to take you through this pyramid so you know exactly what I mean by this. We start at the bottom with our physiological needs. And so we need to breathe, we need food, we need water, etc. And when these needs are met, then we can go on to our safety needs. But when they're not met, we get stuck there. Well, what happens is that if we feel somebody is threatening those needs, then that's where we go. So during our normal course of the day, we're feeling fed and we slept well and we've done all of that. But then it's time to go to lunch. And you go to lunch and you place your order, and then somebody comes in and sits at a table next to you and they place their order, and you're getting hungry and time is going by, and then the food server brings the table next to you their food before you get your food. Now, perhaps you're a little upset about that because, for one thing, you're hungry and you want your food, and another thing, that seems a little unfair that those people are getting their food first. And so you might respond poorly. You might say something rude to the food server in order to inspire that person to get your food out to you. Well, I used to be a food server, and so you don't want to say anything rude to people who handle your food, number one. But number two, that's what happens. Think about the times that you're hungry, that you're tired. You usually don't communicate very well. And if it appears that somebody's preventing you from getting your food or getting your sleep, you really don't communicate very well. So that's physiological. Once those needs are met, we worry about our safety needs, security of body, of employment, of resources. And so here's safety. You're driving down the street and everything's flowing smoothly, just like it should be, and so you're happy. But then all of a sudden somebody starts to pull out in front of you and you have to slam on your brakes. How do you respond? Do you wave at them and wish them a good morning? Well, you might wave at them, but probably with just one finger, and wish them something else. Why do we respond that way? Because our safety needs are threatened. And so we respond poorly when it appears that somebody is threatening our needs. Next is love and belonging. We need friends, we need family, we need to be connected in the workplace. And when it appears that people are preventing us from being connected, then that gets us a little upset. And so you're at work and everything is going smoothly and you're happy. And then all of a sudden, the people that you work with all decide to go out to lunch without inviting you. How does that make you feel? Well, some of you might say, no problem. But some of us would feel hurt that everybody in our work group is going out to lunch without inviting us. That doesn't feel good. And so we get mad. And we refuse to talk to them when they return from lunch. Next is self-esteem. And so we all need our pats on the back. We need people to respect us and to congratulate us on our achievements and just be thankful that we're contributing. And so what happens when you have worked lots and lots of overtime without getting paid because you're an exempt employee, and you leave the office after a 12-day hour and your boss says nothing to you? That doesn't feel good. And so how do we respond? Well, maybe we come in a little later the next day. Maybe we refuse to stay late the following day. That will get the boss back. And then finally, self-actualization. And so Maslow said when all of these needs are met, physiological safety, love, belonging, esteem, then the self-actualization is we want to go further. We want that promotion. We want to contribute to our community. We want to be more than what we are. And actually, the Army came up with the slogan, be all that you can be, in order to tap into the self-actualization. So think about it. When people are about ready to serve in the military, or they used to be, they're usually about 18 or 19 years old. So the Army knew that and realized that 18 and 19-year-olds usually have their physiological needs met by their parents. Their parents are feeding them and housing them. Safety needs are usually met. They're still secure at home. Love and belonging, usually they have friends in school. Esteem, usually they're seniors in high school, and so they're at the top of the pack. And so what's next? Be all that you can be. And so that slogan was very effective for the Army. And that's exactly what it is. And so we begin to worry about morality, creativity, spontaneity. And what happens when morality is upset? So, for example, we want to be more than we are. We apply for a promotion. We don't get it. The person who gets the promotion is not qualified for the promotion, doesn't know as much as we do, hasn't been with the company as long as we have. And we feel that that's just not fair. And so, how do we respond? We may respond very poorly, and perhaps it inspires us to quit. So, we all have these needs. When we feel those needs are being threatened, we get upset. Well, guess what? When you go to have a difficult conversation with somebody, they are going to feel that you are threatening all of their needs. How so? Physiological and safety needs. You're threatening their job when you're having a difficult conversation. And that's one of the first things that they ask. Am I going to lose my job? You're threatening their love and belonging needs. You don't like me. That's the only reason we're having this conversation, is because you don't like me. Esteem needs. You don't respect me. How you're talking to me is disrespectful. Self-actualization needs. This isn't fair. Everybody else is doing it. Why are you just talking to me? And so you'll hear employees say all of these things, and that's their reaction to your threatening their needs. So the good news is you can do something to reduce the threat so that they won't respond poorly. First of all, carefully choose where the conversation will be held. And I say in a neutral place away from traffic. And this is what I mean by that. When you call somebody into your office, that's your territory. And if you're a sports fan, you know that the home team usually wins. And so you don't want to be in your turf and your territory. You want to be someplace neutral if you possibly can. And I learned this the hard way, as most of my lessons are the hard way, when I was HR manager at a firm. And I found out that when I would call people to my office for a difficult conversation, they told me later it felt like walking the Green Mile. If you're not familiar with that movie, the Green Mile is what you had to walk on your way to being electrocuted. So walking to my office was difficult. And then the next thing is that my office door was always open, except for during difficult conversations when it was closed. And I was told later that when people went into my office and the door closed, everybody walking around the office would begin to whisper about why the person was in there with me. And I was right in the middle of traffic, right in the middle of where everything was happening. And so when people left my office, they had to walk out into that traffic. And if they had been crying or were upset, then everybody saw it and began to talk again. So it took me a while to figure out that when I have a difficult conversation, I need to schedule a conference room that was on a different floor than my office. And we could meet there, going into the conference room. Nobody knew why we were going into the conference room. And then after the conversation, I could leave. And the receiver could stay there as long as necessary in order to get himself or herself put back together again before rejoining their coworkers. I got a much better response from my difficult conversations just by making that change. So choose carefully where the conversation will be held. Now, one of the things that frequently happens during training is that people tell me their sad stories. And a gentleman told me that he had made a correction of somebody working on a line, that he didn't consider it to be a difficult conversation. He had just pointed out to a female employee that she was doing something wrong and she needed to do it differently. Unfortunately, he did it in front of all of her coworkers. And then the other thing is they were in a noisy environment. And so it sounded like he was yelling at her when he made the correction. Well, he paid dearly for that mistake. And so he paid by having to deal with human resources and by the employee being upset with him and her coworkers being upset with him. So choose carefully where you're going to say things. And sometimes what doesn't seem like a difficult conversation to you might sound like one to your employee. Next, use a soft entry. Let the listener get prepared. So there are some personality styles that just start talking without waiting for other people to be ready. And for the most part, people need to be ready because people are on their phones, on their computers, and they don't hear what's being said anyway. But the reasoning behind this mostly is so that you don't catch somebody off guard. Once I was asked by an employer to help him fire somebody. And so I helped him get prepared with all of the paperwork that he needed to have. And then we practiced a little bit of how he was going to deliver that message. So he called the employee into his office, and I was sitting there, and he said, "I'm terminating your employment effective immediately. Robin is here to escort you from the building." Well, that didn't allow her to get prepared. Number one, she had no idea it was coming, because he'd never had a difficult conversation with her until this one. And that's what happens sometimes with some personality styles, usually the steady satisfier. They put it off and put it off and put it off until they can't take it anymore. And then they bring the axe down. That's not fair to the employee. One of my favorite sayings is silence equals permission. And so if you're not speaking up and telling people when they're doing something wrong, you're essentially giving them permission to do whatever it is they're doing. And then if you allow them to get away with things for a while until you finally can't take it anymore and you come down and you terminate them, then that's going to cause you some problems. So that's one of the reasons you want to have these difficult conversations before the termination meeting. So what ended up happening in that case is that the employee, who had no idea that her performance was lacking, was terminated in front of me. And then, even worse, I escorted her to her office to collect her belongings and escorted her from the building in front of her coworkers. That's a recipe for disaster. So we'll talk about that termination meeting a little bit later on, because you have to handle it very carefully. But the thing is, let people get prepared that they are going to hear something that they don't want to hear. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment. Next, incorporate the best of our communication styles. Be direct like the dominant so that people know what you're talking about. Be personable in your delivery like the initiator so that people know that you care about them. Be tactful. Choose your words carefully so they don't destroy people. And make sure you've got your facts straight. And so we'll talk more about how to do that. Next, allow the listener to talk. So this is a conversation, and a conversation, both parties are talking. So if you're telling somebody that they are violating policy, why in the world would you need to listen to what they have to say? It's just going to be a bunch of excuses, right? No, if you don't allow yourself to listen, first of all, you might miss out on some facts you didn't have beforehand. And second is that people need to feel heard. So that's one of the complaints that I hear quite often, is that my supervisor doesn't listen to me, my boss doesn't listen to me. People need to feel heard in order to feel that all of this was a fair process. And if it's a one-sided conversation, they're not going to feel that way. And chances are you might learn some information later on down the road that could hurt you because you didn't know it at the time of the conversation. So invite them to talk. And finally, determine how the listener can be successful, because this is what you want out of the conversation. If you're telling somebody that they're violating policy, you want them to be successful and not violate policy anymore. If you're telling somebody they have body odor, you want them to be successful and not have body odor anymore. If you're telling somebody they're terminated, you want them to be successful someplace else. And so all of the conversation is pointed at them being successful. And if you even tell them the only reason we're having this conversation is because I want you to be successful, then you're more than likely going to get the response that you want. So here's how it all looks put together. We've got a little format that we just went over. First of all, you're going to use a door opener statement so that the listener can get prepared to receive your message. And then you're going to incorporate the best of our communication styles so that you deliver the message so that they understand it, but they're not destroyed by it. Then you invite them to talk, and tell them how to be successful. And those are interchangeable. So you can invite them to talk first and then how to be successful, or the other way around, how I have it here. And so this is an example of coaching to improve performance. Now, I am the recipient in all of these difficult conversations, and some of them actually happened and some of them did not. This one did actually happen about 20 years ago. And so I was just starting out as a trainer, and my performance was fine in workshops that I was conducting. I was bringing in clients, and so I wasn't violating policies. My performance was good. The only problem is that every once in a while I said something that sounded a little harsh or critical to some of my coworkers. And I did that one day, and my supervisor had this conversation with me the next day. First of all, she and I had just completed a workshop away from the office, and it had gone very well. And so I was feeling pretty good about that workshop. And she invited me to coffee. So we didn't go back to the office. And so we're on neutral territory. And after we chatted for a while about the workshop and what had gone well and that kind of thing, she said, "Robin, as your supervisor, it is my responsibility to help you be as effective as possible. Therefore, I need to tell you the following. Now, do you think that I knew something was going to be said that I really didn't want to have said?" Yeah, I did. And I probably grabbed the armchair or something so I could brace myself for whatever was coming next. But that's the intent of letting the listener get prepared so they're not caught off guard. She said, "Your directness sounds harsh at times, which hurts the feelings of some of your coworkers." Now, she had to go into a little bit more detail about this, because just saying that, I didn't know what she was talking about. My directness sounds harsh, which hurts the feelings? Like what? What have I said? And this always presents a little bit of a dilemma for people who have to deliver messages like this. How much detail should I go into? Because if I say, well, yesterday when you told so-and-so such and such, then I'm revealing that somebody made a complaint about the employee. But if I don't reveal any particular information, chances are the employee has no idea what I'm talking about. So what do? Well, you start broad and you narrow in if you need to. And then the other thing is you make sure that you talk to employees who have made complaints so that they have your permission, or you have their permission, to make specific examples. So in this case, that's what had happened. When she said, "Your directness sounds harsh at times, which hurts the feelings of some of your coworkers," I said, "Really? Like what? What have I said?" Because I was pretty clueless. She said, "Well, for example, yesterday when you told Steve, I don't like people I don't respect and I don't respect you. That's an example of harshness that hurts the feelings of some of your coworkers." So she provided me with an example. She had the permission of the employee who had talked to her about this example. Had she not, then perhaps she would have been able to provide some other examples that she had overheard, or that she had been the receiving end herself. So that's one of the things that's a little tricky, is that when you're talking to somebody about something, you usually have to provide them with enough information so that they know what you're talking about. But be careful that you don't provide information that someone thinks they told you confidentially. So then she said to me, "I think you will be much more effective if you soften your approach." Now, I didn't know what that meant. What am I supposed to do to soften my approach? And so she told me, soften your approach is choose your words more carefully. Instead of saying what you said, perhaps you could have said this. Your facial expressions, sometimes you look like you're mad, so maybe you could smile a little bit more. When you're walking around, it sounds like you're stomping around sometimes, so perhaps you could soften your footsteps. So she explained to me what she meant by softening my approach. And then she said, "What do you think?" Now, I have no idea what I said in response to that. I think I said, "Oh, okay." But here's the thing. You need to be prepared for somebody to fight back, especially somebody with a dominant personality style. Remember, when people are on the receiving end of this kind of conversation, a lot of times they go into the fight or flight mode. And so they might actually just leave the room or put their head down so they don't have to look at you. But chances are they're going to try to fight you. And so let's pretend that that's what I did. So when she said, "What do you think?" perhaps my response would have been something like, "Well, I think that Steve needs to get a backbone. I'm doing my job, aren't I?" And then what do? Well, sometimes people get flustered when people fight back like that. And they give in. "Oh, okay, you're right. Never mind." Or they fight back. "I'll tell you what's happening." You can't do either one. You have to remain professional. How do you remain professional? You stick to the script. And so chances are my supervisor had rehearsed what she was going to say to me over and over. And if I would have fought back, she just goes back to what she's already rehearsed. Or perhaps she wrote a few notes down, and that's helpful sometimes. Some people, that's your best bet, is to write a couple of notes down so that when you give pushback, you can look at your notes and it'll keep you on track. So here's what I mean by sticking to the script. She delivers this message, and my response is, "I think Steve needs to get a backbone. I'm doing my job, aren't I?" Her response would have been, "Yes, you are doing your job, and perhaps Steve does need to get a backbone. However, your directness sounds harsh at times, which hurts the feelings of some of your coworkers. And as a result of that, they don't want to work with you. You need to be able to work with your coworkers. I suggest you soften your approach. That is my expectation." Now, do you have any questions? All right, so that's sticking to the script. So you first deliver the message in a way that you're not expecting a pushback, but if you get that pushback, you need to be ready to remain professional, but deliver that message. So that's coaching to improve performance. Now, talking to an employee about a personal issue. I did not receive this message. I was not on the receiving end, but I just used my name anyway. So here's how this goes. "Robin, I need to talk to you about a sensitive issue." Uh-oh, a sensitive issue? This isn't going to be fun. "There are times that you dress somewhat provocatively, which detracts from your professionalism. You will be much more effective if you wear clothing that is less revealing. Do you have any questions or concerns?" All right, now we need to go over this one. First of all, people have said to me, "Can I say that somebody's dressing provocatively?" Well, sure, you can. If you'd rather choose different words, then by all means, choose words that you're comfortable with. But one of the things that people are afraid of is, what if I'm a guy saying this to a woman? Aren't I going to get sued for sexual harassment? Well, anybody can get sued for sexual harassment, but the thing is that those are things to take into consideration before delivering your message. Should I have a witness here? If I'm a male delivering this message to a female, should I have another female here? If you do, make sure that it's another supervisor and not one of the employee's coworkers. Perhaps if you're a male, you don't want to deliver this message. You want to have a female deliver this message to another female. There are some conversations that it's better that somebody of the same sex deliver that message. So all of those things you need to take into consideration. Now, one of the personal issues that people frequently have to talk about is body odor or bad breath. And so I want to run through that scenario with you because that one can lead to some other issues that you need to know about. So let's say, "Robin, I need to talk to you about a sensitive issue. There are times that you have an odor that is distracting from your professionalism. Is there something that I need to know that's causing the odor?" Because sometimes people taking medication causes them to have an odor. And if the answer is, "Yes, I take a medication that's causing this odor," then the conversation goes in a different direction because the person has just revealed to you that they have a medical issue that probably needs to be accommodated. Or if the answer was, "Well, I have this odor because of the food I eat, because of my ancestry or national origin," then that's a protected class that you need to accommodate as well. So not going to get all into accommodations at this point. If that's something that you need to know more about, please contact me. But the thing is that when you're talking about body odor or bad breath, those things could be caused by medical issues or by protected classes that you might have to accommodate. But if I said you have an odor that is distracting from your professionalism, is there something that I need to know about that's causing the odor? And my answer was no. Then the next thing to say is you need to take care of the odor. And that's it. You don't tell them what deodorant to buy. You don't tell them if they brought additional clothing to work, they could change it. You don't go into all of the things that they could do to get rid of the odor. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, if you advise them on something such as, hey, I use Mitchum Extra Strength, you might try it, and then they do, and they get a rash or react badly to it, then you've got a little bit of a problem. The other reason is you want to get in and out of these conversations as fast as you possibly can. It's really embarrassing for the person on the receiving end, as you might imagine. And going into all of these suggestions about how they might get rid of this odor is just going to make the situation worse for them. Now, if they ask for your advice, then perhaps you could tell them you might bring some extra clothing, or perhaps we can set you up with a fan or something like that. But otherwise, just get in there and get out of there as quickly as possible. Failure to meet expectations. This one really happened. And so one of the things that I said is that one of the reasons you want to allow people to talk is so that you can get all of the information so that you decide what to do next. So supervisor said to me, Robin, we need to talk about yesterday's workshop. The workshop ended 20 minutes late, which cut into the participant schedules. Did something happen to prevent you from ending on time? So if my response would have been, yes, I had a participant who had a heart attack and I performed CPR on him until the paramedics got there. And then after the paramedics wheeled him away, I finished up the workshop, and that's why I was 20 minutes late. If my answer would have been that, then the response from my supervisor would have been, well done. But that was not my response. My response was, yes, it ended late because the participants were talking so much and there was nothing I could do about it. The response from the supervisor then was, it is your responsibility as the facilitator to ensure that the workshops end on time. And that's the expectation that I have of you. Policy violation with disciplinary action. I was not on the receiving end of this. Actually, I was the sender of the message on this one. Robin, I need to talk to you about yesterday afternoon. You indicated in an email that you had a couple of glasses of wine at lunch. Am I correct that you had been drinking? So again, here is the fact finding, because things aren't always as they present themselves. So sometimes you need to do a little digging to make sure that whatever you do as far as discipline is actually appropriate. So the listener of the message said, yeah, I had a friend come into town and we had a couple of glasses of wine to celebrate her new marriage. Then I continue with this conversation. However, if the response would have been, no, I wish I would have been drinking, I was just joking around, then my response would have been, then don't joke around about stuff like this, because then we end up having to have these kind of conversations. But the response had been, yes, I had been drinking. So then I said, drinking during working hours is a violation of company policy. Now, you only get to say that if you actually have a company policy that says that. Some companies do, some companies don't. And so this is the fact finding also. Make sure you know what your company policies are. One of the things that I like to do in training is ask people about their company policies. And most people who are in my training are supervisors and HR professionals. And a lot of times they have no idea what their company policies say. So how are you going to discipline somebody for violating company policy when you have no idea what that company policy says? I tell people the employee handbook should be their best friend, and that if you are going to reprimand somebody, go to the handbook first to make sure that you've got that information correct. You're not just making it up, because that's what happens sometimes too. And then, as far as being successful, please refrain from drinking during work hours in the future. Now, in this particular instance, drinking during working hours was a serious offense. It wasn't a terribly serious offense, and that depends upon your company as well. Drinking during working hours for some companies is immediate termination. For other companies, it's a verbal reprimand. So there's no law that stipulates what your discipline should be in response to policy violation. That's something that your company needs to figure out. But you want to make sure that everybody is disciplining the same for company violation. That can get you into some legal problems if people are not. So that's one reason that, especially in companies where supervisors haven't had a lot of training and there's not been a lot of discussion, that people in HR are overseeing all of the disciplinary action that happens to make sure that is consistent. Inconsistency leads to discrimination claims. And so it's very important that you are making sure that discipline is consistent. Something also with this is that I had that write-up ready to go. And so when the employee said, yes, I had been drinking, I took the write-up out of a folder and gave it to the employee to sign. Now, had the response been, oh no, I wish I would have been drinking, then that write-up would have been shredded. But because I was pretty confident that I had my facts straight, we were ready to go. One of the things that I would do also when I wrote people up is that I would allow them to take the write-up home with them and review it and then turn it in the next day. And if they had any questions or concerns, I would be happy to continue the conversation then. Now, some people think, oh, you can't do that. You can't let people take a write-up with them. They'll take it to an attorney. Well, people have the right to have a copy of disciplinary action taken against them, so they can take it to an attorney the next day if they want to. But I never got anyone who came back to me and said, I totally disagree with that. Now, the reason I allowed them to take it home with them and read it is because during this fight or flight syndrome, they can't really hear what's being said. They've got all of those voices in their head. Am I being fired? You don't like me. This isn't fair. All of that is going on, and I'm having to compete with it. And so I found that when I allowed them to take that documentation home, that when they came back the next day with it signed, there were no questions. There were no concerns. They agreed that they had messed up, and then we went on our way. And that got much better responses than forcing them to sign it at that moment when they were all discombobulated. Next, let's say that we have that second policy violation. Now on here, I put it's a second policy violation, but you don't have to terminate after somebody has a second policy violation. You can have a first write-up, second write-up, final probation, written write-up, whatever you want to do in your organization is fine. But you want to be consistent. And if you are going to terminate somebody, you don't just have this conversation. There's prep work that you have to do beforehand. And so there are all sorts of documents that you have to provide the employee when you terminate them, including final paycheck. And so you have all of this gathered together before you have this conversation. Now, there are some industries that you don't have to have the final paycheck at time of termination, but those are few. And so for the most part, everybody listening here probably has to have that. So call the employee in and say something like this. This is going to be a difficult conversation. You were intoxicated at work again yesterday, which is the second violation of the company's policy against the use of alcohol during work hours. Unfortunately, I am terminating your employment. Do you have any questions or concerns? Now, you may think that's the stupidest thing to ask them if they have any questions or concerns. Yeah, I'm concerned about the fact that I don't have a job anymore. But that's not what they say. What they say is, will you fight if I apply for unemployment? And you are required by law to provide them with a pamphlet that tells them how to apply for unemployment. And so that's one of the things that sometimes employers don't know, is that regardless of the reason that people are leaving, you have to give them a pamphlet on how to apply for unemployment. It's especially galling when you're terminating somebody for something like this, but it is a requirement. They'll ask about their insurance. And so if you provide medical insurance, you have to provide them with COBRA or CalCOBRA forms that shows them how to continue their insurance. If you are providing a 401k, you have to provide them with information about that. So there's all sorts of things at this point that you give them to help them in their transition. And so their question usually isn't, what am I going to do now that I'm unemployed? Their question is, what about this? What about that? And you have all of that information there to help them with the transition. And then when you are escorting them out the door, don't do it in front of their coworkers. Don't make them take that walk of shame, because if they do, how you handle the situation determines what they're going to do next. Now, we've all heard lots of stories where people, after they've been terminated, go out to their car, get their gun, and come back in. And you don't want that to happen. So how you treat them as they go out the door determines what they do next. Don't make them take the walk of shame in front of their coworkers, and wish them well on their way out the door. I wish you the best of luck in the future. So even if you can't stand this person that you're getting rid of, and you are so happy that you give the opportunity to get rid of them, don't let them know that on the way out. Treat them with respect on the way out, and chances are they'll go away quietly and leave you alone. Typical two-way communication is what the speaker thinks he said, what he actually said, and what the listener thinks he said. So let me break that down for you a little bit more. We say stuff and we don't even know what we're saying sometimes. An example of that is when I used to go to Mexicali restaurant, I would order a cheese omelet. Every single time I went there, I ordered a cheese omelet. Except one day, I thought I was ordering a cheese omelet, and out of my mouth came the word quesadilla. I had ordered a cheese quesadilla. Now that's what the food server heard, but I still thought I was ordering a cheese omelet. And when the food server brought me a cheese quesadilla, I looked at it, I looked back at her, and I said, I thought I ordered a cheese quesadilla. Now in my head, I'm still thinking I'm saying omelet, but out of my mouth is coming the words quesadilla. And I said, I thought I ordered a cheese quesadilla. And she said, you did. And I looked back at the cheese quesadilla and I just went, okay, whatever. I have no idea why I'm receiving this food when I clearly ordered something else. Now, I did a replay in my head after she walked away. How could I have possibly gotten a cheese quesadilla when I so clearly said, and then in the instant replay, I heard myself say it. We don't listen to what we say a lot of times, and we think we're saying something when we're really saying something else. And then there's what the listener thinks we said. And especially during these difficult conversations, they don't hear so well. So I hired a secretary from Sacramento many years ago. And when I was offering her the job, it was $4 an hour less than what she had been making. And she said to me, is there any way I can make more money? And I said, at the end of your 3-month introductory period, we will evaluate your performance, and perhaps we can give you an increase at that time, is what I said. What she heard was that at the end of 3 months, she was getting a $4 an hour raise. That's what she heard. So when she came to my door on that 3-month anniversary with her hand out, and I said, that's not what I said, she thought I was lying to her, and she hated me ever after. And every time I walked past her in the hallway, she let me know that. So what I should have done is, after I had that conversation with her, I should have sent her an email that said, just to summarize our conversation, at the end of your 3-month introductory period, we will evaluate your performance. Perhaps we can give you an increase at that time. Was that your understanding? And when she emailed back yes, then there we go. I put that little email in my file in case we have a difficult conversation later. If she would have said, no, that wasn't my understanding, then we could have that conversation again. So what I'm trying to tell you is documentation is really important. We have a whole PowerPoint presentation on documentation and how to do it. But the thing is that when you have difficult conversations with people, sometimes you need to document them. I mean, certainly if you are disciplining somebody, you need to document it, even when you are giving a verbal warning. Some people think that a verbal warning doesn't need to be written down. It does need to be written down. And some people say, well, then it's no longer a verbal warning, it's a written warning. No, you just check the box that says what level of discipline it is, and it's a verbal warning. And so you want to write these things down in case they come back, and you want to make sure that it was clear what you actually said. So difficult conversations are less difficult for everyone involved. When you, as the sender of the message, think of the response that you want, then deliver your message to get that response. Try to lessen the threat of the situation by choosing the environment carefully, where the conversation will be held. One of the things to think about also is seating arrangements. And so you want to make sure that you don't have a desk or a table in between you and the receiver so that it doesn't look like you're on opposing sides. So choose all of that carefully when you're going to have the conversation. If it's a Friday afternoon and it's time to go, maybe that's not the time to have the conversation. Maybe you wait until Monday so that you're in a better place to send it and they're in a better place to receive it. Use a soft entry and let people get prepared to hear. Make sure that you are giving them all of your attention and that you have all of their attention. Be direct so that you're very clear, but be personable. Let them know through your delivery that you care about them as a person and are trying to help them be successful. Be tactful, choosing your words carefully, and make sure you've got your facts straight. If you don't have all of your facts before you go into this conversation, gather your facts during the conversation. Don't make any kind of decision on what you're going to do with somebody until you have all of those facts. Let the listener talk, and it doesn't have to change anything. If they have violated policies such as attendance, and you know they've been late, and you have the documentation right in front of you that they're late, and they want to tell you why, don't just see it as a bunch of excuses. See it as an opportunity for you to listen to them so that they can have their say. It doesn't have to change anything that you do. Just let them talk. And mostly tell them how to be successful. That's the point of the entire conversation. The reason you're having the conversation with them is to tell them something that they need to know in order to be successful. So a difficult conversation can make the difference between success and failure for a valued employee. And I'll take you back to that conversation my supervisor had with me about my directness being harsh at times. I didn't know that before that conversation. And I'm sure it took a lot of guts for her to say that to me because she was afraid of how I would respond. But she cared enough about me to have that difficult conversation. And that was one of the best gifts that I have ever received from somebody. So much so that 20 years later, it's in my PowerPoint presentation. So don't be afraid of that conversation. Have it. It can be the best thing that you do for your employee. Thanks, everybody. Hope that you'll tune in next week.